Hi there. In this tutorial I'm going to demonstrate how to create the basic effects you can see in this video. So we've got a cube that's bouncing with physics here, and you can see it's got fur on it. And then you can see the same cube with the same fur. I have some objects passing through the cube and affecting the hair particles. And I just play it backwards here just for fun. And you can see the hair is also affected by a wind force, but it isn't a wind force that's making these hairs move as the object goes through, it's the object itself. So we've got a number of things going on. We've got physics, we've got a couple of particle systems for the two different types of hair, and then we've got the interaction of the hair with a physical object. So I'm not going to completely recreate that scene because that's quite processor intensive and that would be quite difficult to do while also recording a video. But I will show how each of the elements are created. So to begin with, let's just add a plane, scale it up, bring it up a little bit, and we'll press Ctrl A and apply rotation and scale. Whenever you're going to use physics and interactions of particles and physics objects and things like that, it's always worth applying rotation and scale. This relates to the menu on the right hand side, which you call it with N. If I undo that apply, you can see the scale here is -6. Just the direction that I went when I scaled it, and the dimensions are 13 by 13. If I now Ctrl A and apply rotation and scale, you can see the scale has now dropped to 1. So effectively I've reset the scale on this. It's a scale of 1. This is, as it were, the real size of this object. And that's necessary due to some of the add-ons in Blender not necessarily using the scale factor as they should. So let's give this some basic colour. We'll make it a light blue colour and we'll drag that down to here so we can see that in the viewport. And I'm just going to add a simple cube, move that over to here somewhere, up here, and I'm going to add some rotation so that it's not completely square on, as it were. And we'll give that a basic material, and we'll make this a sort of yellow colour, I think. And again, just to be on the safe side, I'm applying rotation and scale. So obviously when I press play at the moment, nothing happens. So the first thing we need to do is select that cube and go to the physics tab over here and say add active. You notice it's now got a green line around it, and if I press play, the cube drops. Unfortunately though, it just drops through the world, and that's because this object is not yet physical. However, if I made this one active, that too would fall down, and we don't want that. So I'm going to add passive this time, so it means it's a physical object, but just a collision physical object. It's not affected by gravity. So now when I press play, my cube bounces off that surface. And perhaps I'll make it a little higher, just to give it a bit more force. And there we go. And there are a few parameters that we can change. If I come over to the physics panel for this object, one of the things we can do is change the way that Blender works out where the collision is. So mesh means that whatever the shape, it will follow that. Now this is a very simple object. Using mesh makes Blender work a lot harder because it has to know where every vertex in the object is in order to work out where the collisions are. For such a simple object, we only really need something like box. So it will draw a box, or imagines a box, that is the shape of this plane. So that's basically a flat box. And that's much simpler for Blender to work out. And you can see we're still getting valid collisions. So then we can also affect things like friction and bounciness. So if I turn friction down to 0, and we'll kick off the animation again, you can see we get a bit more spinning because there's no resistance to slipping one way or the other. Or I'll put friction right up, and now you can see that slight rotation when it hits gives it some force. So we'll put it back down to about middle, and we'll turn bounciness right up. And you can see we're getting a lot more bounce. It's bounced enough that it's fallen off the edge. But of course there's more than two surfaces involved here, so there's this one as well. So what if we turn friction on both of them down, and I'll turn bounciness back down to a low value. So let's try that. And what you will tend to find is that it's okay in this case because we've got such a simple shape, but they will often just keep slipping forever because there is no friction calculation at all. So we'll put that up to mid, and we'll put bounciness on both of them up to high. And now you can see it bounces all over the place. So I'll turn that down to mid for the plane, not quite as bad, but still bounces off the edge. And we'll turn it down a bit for the cube. So there we go, that's quite a good bounce now, and I'm just going to move my plane, I think, rather than moving the cube or changing the attitude of the cube, whatever. So there we go, we've got a nice basic collision there, perhaps a little bit more bounce, just to make it a bit more interesting. So that's the very simplest part of physics. We don't have any hair on this cube yet, so let's look at that. So I'm going to say new, we'll select hair. I put two hair systems on mine, a long hair system and a short hair system. I'll just do a single hair system for this in order to keep things simple. So I've said hair and immediately I've got that. So let's see what happens when I press play. Absolutely nothing. The hair just carries on sticking straight out like that. And the reason is because I haven't selected use hair dynamics. So let's click that now and press play. You can see the animation's taking a bit longer now, but you can now see we're getting some interesting effects. The hair's moving relative to the movement of the object and flops around a bit afterward as well. So let's make it a little shorter. Let's try a hair length of 2, and then just to make it a little more interesting, we'll say advanced, and under velocity we'll add a little random. So you can see now, rather than just coming straight out of the face that the hair is attached to, there's a randomness to the direction of the hair, which makes it a little more realistic. But again, you can see they're responding to the movement of the object. So let's add a simple lamp. I'll just have it there, perhaps slightly to one side. We'll give it a reasonable brightness, and we'll just have 128 bounces, and let's have a look at what that looks like as a render. So we've got hairs there. They're not very graceful hairs, but they are there. You can see these harsh corners on them, but they're the same color as the cube, and that's because we need to select the cube, go to its materials and add a new material, and we'll call this one hair material. We'll give this a basic starting colour, I think, of just blue. We'll give it there as well. But again, you can't see that on the hair as yet. So come back to the particle system, scroll down to here under render, and you can see here the material that it's currently using is the cube material. So I'll click in here and select the hair material, and now we're seeing a slightly different effect. So what can we do to make those hairs look a little better? There are a number of options. Strand render is one of the ones that you can use to help the hairs render faster. There's a certain amount of debate about that, but in theory that means it only renders what you can see. It doesn't render parts of the hair that are occluded or behind something. And if we click B-spline, that should calculate the curves a little better. It's a little more accurate in the way it calculates the curves, but we've still only got that many steps. It's also worth using adaptive render. And if we come up here, we can increase the number of segments as well. But obviously this is increasing the calculations that Blender has to do. So let's go back to the beginning. I had 7 segments, so we'll try that. And we'll just let it roll through a little bit. And we'll see how that's looking. So that's a little more graceful. So in terms of the settings I used for my hair, obviously I had a lot more hair particles. But under hair dynamics, I used all of the default settings, even down to the quality. So obviously if you use a higher number for quality, the way the hair flicks around in the wind and so on will be more accurate, but it will be a lot more calculations for Blender to do. Once you've created your animation, you will want to bake all dynamics, and that will bake things like the movement. It will basically write to a disk file the movement of the cube and things like that, as well as the movement of all the hair particles, which should make it easy to scrub through, although that doesn't always work with particles. So the next thing that we can play around with is that not all the hairs need to be the same size. So let's give this something like 0.1 randomness on the size. So there'll be some variation, 10% variation on the size. If you don't want the cube itself to show up in the render, untick this here, the emitter, and then you just get the hair and not the cube. And you might put some other object in there, perhaps grouped with the cube, but I'll leave it on for now. I used adaptive render, so this is how far the hair has to bend before a new segment is created, and how far the minimum distance it will have to travel down the hair to make a new segment. And I used 3 steps and B-spline. Again, it's the calculation method for how the curvature of the hair is calculated. Again, you can add some randomness to the length of the hair here. It's just another place that you can do it. So I'm just going to come out of rendered mode for a moment, because we're now going to have a look at children. So children is a way to calculate hairs in between without going through all of the same level of calculation that you would do for the original hair system. So I'm going to say interpolated. Simple means it just produces a group of hairs for each one that you've added. You can see they've all got the same bend on them and so on. Interpolated means it will take a couple of hairs or several hairs and then create hairs that are both bent and lengthwise at some point in between the other two. So it's interpolating what that hair should look like. So it gives you a slightly more natural look. Now the default, you can see we've got a render of 100 hairs for every one of the original ones. The display is what it's displaying here, 10. So I'm just going to turn that down to 10 because this will soon cause Blender to slow down quite a bit. Uniform is adding a slight roughness to it, so it's sort of non-intuitive. I'm going to put 0.025 on there, so that's 2.5%. Size I left at default. Clumping I set to, for this one, 0.06. So this is how it draws the hairs together at the bottom or at the top. And shape I set to 0.12. So these are just my initial settings. You can obviously play around and find the ones that work for you. I then added a wave kink. The amplitude starts off as way too high, so I set that to 0.02 or 2%, but I accepted the defaults other than that. So then we come down to cycle settings. My thoughts were that the hair has probably been cut at some point, so rather than it coming to an invisible sharp point, I set the tip to 0.1. So this is how thick the tip is, but then I said close tip. So actually what it does is it does make it a sharp point, but it has a very steep curve, as it were. Rather than very, very slowly reaching a point, it is the same thickness pretty much all the way along, and then right at the end it just closes the tip together. And I set the root thickness, how thick the hairs were, to 0.45, which is quite thin. So let's just make it recalculate just in case it needs to. And there it goes. And you notice the hair has mass as well, because that swings up. It's not just, as it were, the air of the movement of the object moving the hair. You can now see it's a much finer hair system. And be careful zooming in the way I just did when you're using the preview mode, because when you've got a lot of hairs on there, suddenly Blender has to render an awful lot and it can just crash. So make sure you save plenty of times. So that's got our basic hair system, and if I just let that roll on a moment, what I think I will do is shorten that hair a little bit. So we'll come up to the top, it's one of the easiest places to do it, and let's set the hair length to 1 and just play that animation. You could just bake it, of course. Blender's telling me up here that it's only managing 5 frames per second, and it's red because it knows that my target frames per second is 25. So it knows it's not showing a real-time version of the animation. So I'm just leaving it for a moment while the hairs continue to animate. You can see they have a certain stiffness because the ones on the top particularly are sticking out, and they're just settling down. So I can see that I would need more than 250 frames to get this to settle properly, so let's set this to 400. Make sure under your cache for your hair that the end point is the same as the end of your animation, assuming you want your hair particles to animate all the way to the end. So I'm going to set this to 400 as well. And then we can just click play to carry on animating. Although, of course, the hair's pretty much settled now. So that yellow line is obviously the buffer for the movement of the cube, the physics movement, and then the red line is for the hair particles. If your physics is continuing throughout the animation, you will also need to increase your physics cache. It's unfortunate that they're not all tied together. So I'm going to increase this one to 400 as well, because later on we're going to do something with some physics to affect this hair. So if I put that back here now and press play, you can see now the physics buffer is topping up as well, although there's not really anything going on with physics. So that's how to create the basic hair system, and we now want to affect it with some other things. So now we're going to add a force field. So Shift A, force field, and wind. And there it is. I'm going to make it bigger. It doesn't affect the force itself, just so we can see it. It's important this is in the same layer as the particles you want to affect. I'm going to rotate on the X 90, and the distance between these rings gives you an indication of how strong the wind is. So it's not very strong at the moment. And by default, there's no limit on its influence. So the wind is just as strong over here as it is over here. So let's just let that animation go again. You can see it's having to re-buffer everything now because we've got this wind force in here. But I think you can already see that the wind isn't really having much of an effect. And that's because it's quite small. So by default, the shape is a plane, the strength is 1, flow 1, and so on. Flow causes particles to follow a path within the wind, especially if it's got noise of some description in it. So you can see the hair's still coming to a stop, so that wind's not doing anything. So while it's still running, let's put this up to 12, which is the value I used. And And suddenly you can see it is affecting it. The hair's being blown off to one side. If you're creating human heads and things like that, one of the problems you will get is hair passing through the head itself. That's still something I think yet to be fully worked out in Blender, but what you can of course do is have an invisible skull cap, things like that, and then use some kind of collision with the head itself. You can of course add some stiffness to the hair, and there are some settings in the hair that you can use. Plus of course you'll very often use the combing options. So in here, for example, you can particle edit, which allows you to trim hair particles and comb them in particular places and lift them off the surface from which they are emitting. But what it doesn't do is allow you to keep the dynamics of the hair, so it won't blow around in the wind after you do that. You can have one or the other at the moment. So I'm not going to get into that at the moment. But that's also a reason why you might want multiple hair particles, some very short, stiff ones, as well as some longer, more flowing ones. But if I come back here, you can see this is now blowing in the wind. So in terms of my wind force, you can see that's now got larger separation between those rings, and that's what's showing that it's a stronger wind force. I also added some flow of 3 to sort of give it a more interesting effect. The seed doesn't matter too much unless you have multiple ones, and then you want to have a different seed for each one. And I set the noise to about 5, so that just adds some randomness to it. I didn't use any fall off, which is what this is all about. So if we let that go now, we should get a little bit more of the high frequency stuff that you might get from gusty winds. So you can see in fact the flow seems to have slowed it down quite a bit. So maybe we want to use a lower flow than that. So we'll go with a flow 1.5. Flow will tend to sort of increase the drag as well. And it may even be that the wind force is a bit too high because obviously the hair is just shooting straight out there at the moment. Let's try a strength of 6. You will need to play around with it. No single set of settings is going to be right because it's affected by all sorts of things. You can even have wind forces affected by collisions. And of course you could animate the strength of this force if you wanted it to be there to be no wind at first and then to add wind later on. So one of the other things I did was I actually added a collision for this surface to try to keep the hairs above it. I don't think it was that successful, but we'll add that now. So collision, it's a particle collision, increase the soft body and cloth, and then let's see what that looks like. And we can see how much hair is going through by looking underneath. And it's not too bad actually. So your results may vary, but that's essentially trying to keep the hair on the surface of this plane rather than it going through the surface. And I think perhaps we need to turn that wind force up again. Let's go for 10. So that's wind and basic physics affecting the hair. But how can we have an object affecting the hair? And you may already have guessed based on what I just did. So first of all, let's remember that our hair is settling down somewhere around frame 250. Now I'm going to select my object, and just to make things easy, I'm going to click this little eye symbol next to the particle system, which is going to hide the hairs. So now everything will go a lot quicker because it's not having to calculate the hair. I'm now going to add another object and make that a UV sphere, and let's put it over here and perhaps make it a little smaller. Again, Control A, add rotation and scale. We'll give that another color. And then what we're going to do is animate it. So somewhere around frame 200, I'm going to give it a keyframe and we'll make that location. And then I'm going to go to something like frame 300 and move this object to somewhere like that, or perhaps over there a bit more, and press I for location. So let's have a look. Use these little markers to jump between keyframes. How close that gets to the cube. That's pretty close. So that should pass through the hair. So let's call our hair back up again. So we'll select our cube, switch on our particle system again. We'll come back to here because you can see the buffer was slightly broken, and we'll press play. So the hair's settling down again, and then our sphere starts to move and just passes straight through the hair. There's no interaction at all, much as you'd expect. So how can we make that sphere interact with the hair? First of all, click in here and we'll say collision. So that means it will collide with particles. We'll then turn the soft body and cloth up to maximum, and then we'll press play. So you should just be able to see now that it's starting to push the hairs. Again, it's not going to be 100%, especially in the preview. And also, it will be affected by the quality of the hair animation. So that 5, if you remember, that we've got it set to in the hair quality settings, that will influence how many times it checks to see if there's been a collision or an influence of some kind. So that will affect how quickly and how effectively it responds. So let's limit this to 310 frames, I think now, just so it comes round more quickly. And let's look from this angle. So here comes the cube settling down, and the sphere is starting to move, and you can see it's pushing the hairs. Just be able to make that out. If I stop it a moment and I turn off the children, so set that to none, and then let it carry on, you can see it is interacting with those hairs, it's pushing them. And overall, the effect works quite well, even though some of the hairs will pass through the object. So that's shown you how to set a basic hair system up, and how to set up some basic physics that will influence the hair, and how to cause collisions with another animated object. So the only thing that's left really is some basic settings for rendering the hair. So let's call up the node editor, select our cube, and select our hair material. So all we've got is a basic diffuse material at the moment. And I'm going to turn the children back on just to give us enough hairs to really see what we're doing, because they are quite fine. So I'm just going to stop the rendering while I set this up, so that's why that's gone blank. So the first node I'm going to add under input is hair info. So we've got some interest. It is strand, intercept, thickness and tangent normal. I'm going to add a color ramp from the converter section. I'm going to set, let's have blue on the one side, and let's just have white on the other side, why not? And we'll pull that up a little bit and that one down a little bit, so it's a bit sharper. I'm going to take the intercept out of here into there. So intercept is essentially, if you imagine the hair represented as two lines that are running parallel along the hair, when you get to the end of the hair, those lines collide. That's where they intercept. So this is essentially measuring how far along the hair we are. So it will allow me to change the colour of the hair or other things along the length of the hair. So I don't need this diffuse now. I'm going to add a shader, which is a hair shader. And I'm going to take this colour and put it into there. I'm going to set this to transmission because I want hair that's semi-translucent. And I'm going to add a shader which is a mix shader and put that into the top part of that one and the output into the surface. Just move these in so you can see them. And now I'm going to add another shader which is a glossy. Set it to my preferred method, and just for interest, rather than leaving it white, I'm just going to add a slight colour to it. So I'm going to add a sort of pinkish colour and connect that to the other side of the shader. And I'm going to set the roughness to 0.02. And then finally I need to control this mix. So I'm going to add a layer weight node. I'm going to use the facing output, so this determines the angle that a light ray has bounced off the object, in this case the hairs, and I set these to about 0.3. So that's a very basic hair system setup. So let's have a look at what that renders like. So you can now see we've got some colour at the start of the hair, but it rapidly fades out to white. If I pause it a moment again, we could bring that white all the way to the end and bring the blue further up, and then let it go again. And you can see now we've got blue for most of the length, and it fades to white at the top. And there's no reason that you couldn't have more colours, of course. So we could take that down to there and perhaps make it red. So now we've got hair that starts off a sort of scarlet red colour, goes through a blue colour and then fades to white again. You can change the blend factor up here to affect how glossy the hair is. And I'm also using quite a fine glossiness here, so it's very shiny hair. We could make it slightly more dull hair by increasing the roughness. So you can see it reflects more light, but in a more random direction. But it gives you a softer look. I'll just zoom in on that a little bit so you can see it slightly better. And I'll let it run for a few more samples than the 10 that it's currently doing. So we'll give that 50. And that's really all there is to it. So I hope you found that interesting, and I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot. If you enjoy these tutorials, don't forget to click like and subscribe. I also have a Facebook page and a Twitter account, and I now have a Patreon page as well, and I'll provide links to all of those in the description below. So I'll see you in the next tutorial. Thanks a lot.